Hello everyone, this is Jeff with Mississippi and the Civil War. I've got kind of a special episode for you today. This is our first film episode, and I'm going to be talking about the movie The Crisis, which was a silent film that was made in 1916, and it was the first feature film that was actually shot in the state of Mississippi, and it was a Civil War epic, so it fits in with the theme of this channel quite well. And I first learned about The Crisis when I was working at the old Courthouse Museum in Vicksburg. The director at the time, Gordon Cotton, told me some great stories about this silent film, The Crisis, that had been filmed out in the Vicksburg National Military Park, and how they had used Mississippi National Guardsmen to portray the Union and Confederate soldiers. And I really wanted to see the movie, but for the longest time it wasn't available. But it really piqued my interest, so I started doing some research on the film. And fortunately, over the years, a lot of information has come to light about the movie. And in fact, it is available now for viewing on YouTube. So I thought this was a perfect time to give a little background on Mississippi's first feature film. And to begin with, I need to give you a little bit of background on the history of Civil War movies. Because The Crisis was not the first Civil War film to be made. In fact, they had been made for quite some time prior to The Crisis, but I want to give you just a little bit of background on the history of Civil War movies. And one of the first movies, or Civil War movies, date back to the very beginning of American cinema. One of the earliest was The Guerrilla from 1908 by famed director W.D. Griffith. The plot concerned a heroic Union soldier who broke through enemy lines to rescue his Southern girlfriend from a dastardly Confederate renegade. Kind of an interesting storyline for Griffith, whose father, Colonel Jacob Griffith, had commanded the 1st Kentucky Cavalry CSA. Another early film, and one that actually concerned the war in Mississippi, was The Girl Spy Before Vicksburg from 1910. And it concerned the exploits of Nan, the Girl Spy. And in this film, Nan portrayed a Confederate agent who went on a gangerous mission to blow up a bridge and destroy a Federal ammunition train. And shown in the illustration here is Jean Gontier, who portrayed Nan, the Girl Spy. The movie is available on YouTube if you would like to watch it. It's only 14 minutes long, although the version I have seen on YouTube does have title cards that are in Dutch, so some of the action may be a little more difficult to follow, but it is available for viewing. And there were many other Civil War themed films such as these in the early 1900s, and it's not hard to see why they were popular with audiences. The Civil War was less than 50 years in the past. There were still lots of veterans of that war living at the time. The children of those veterans were very interested in what their fathers and grandfathers had done during the war, and they had grown up hearing tales about the Civil War. So it's not unusual that they would be interested in seeing films on Civil War topics. And without a doubt, the most important Civil War film of the silent era was the D.W. Griffith classic, Birth of a Nation, which was released in 1915. Based on the book The Klansman by Thomas Dixon Jr., it was the story of Civil War, Reconstruction, and the restoration of white supremacy in the South through the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Shown in the illustration is Thomas Dixon, along with the cover art for the movie tie-in version of the book. Birth of a Nation cost $110,000 to make, which was a huge sum for a film at that time. Griffith's 4 films that preceded Birth of a Nation had only cost between $5,000 and $10,000 each, just to give you an idea. In the filming of the movie, Griffith pioneered many of the movie techniques that are still used today. And in fact, movie historian Jack Spears wrote that Griffith's, quote, superb use of visual imagery, movement, stunning photography, including innovations such as irising, close-ups, and the use of stills, intelligent and refined editing, and even music established the artistic supremacy of the director. And the Birth of a Nation went on to become a huge hit. It grossed over $10 million on its initial release. And you would think this would have inspired a lot of other film companies to come out with their own high-budget Civil War films. But this was really not the case. Many studios were really intimidated to be compared to Birth of a Nation, and they felt that their films would be found lacking. And so you really didn't see, for after the Birth of a Nation, a lot of contenders for the next hit Civil War film. But there was one studio, however, that was willing to take up the challenge. And that was the Selig Polyscope Company of Chicago, Illinois. William N. Selig, a native of Chicago who was born during the Civil War, in fact, he was born March 14, 1864, was the founder of the studio. The future studio executive got his start in the entertainment business as a magician in 1894, and he billed himself as a Selig Conjurer. And from this humble beginning, he expanded and developed his act into a minstrel show and picked up somewhere along the way the rank of colonel. Selig saw his first movie in 1895 on a kinetoscope, which had been invented by Thomas Edison. It didn't project the movie on a screen. It was contained in a wooden cabinet. And although it was pretty crude, Selig saw the commercial possibilities for film. And he began making movies in 1896, and over the next decade, the studio that he founded prospered. By 1909, he had full-time movie facilities in California, Louisiana, and Illinois. And after seeing The Birth of a Nation, Selig began searching for a Civil War novel that he could adapt into a film. He quickly acquired the rights to the novel The Crisis by American novelist Winston Churchill, no relation to the British politician of the same name. This novel was first published in 1901, and it had been a bestseller in the United States, going through 34 editions with 750,000 copies sold from 1901 to 1909. So Selig thought he had the perfect property to turn into a hit film. And in writing the book, Churchill had really gone out of his way to make it historically accurate as possible. He had consulted with noted historians of the day. He read numerous letters and diaries by participants of the Civil War. And as Abraham Lincoln was a major character in the novel, Churchill contacted people who had known the president just to get a feel for what Lincoln was like. And among those people that he contacted was Congressman Robert R. Hitt, who as a young reporter had covered the Lincoln-Douglas debates for the Chicago Tribune. And the plot of The Crisis concerns the coming of the Civil War and how the major events of the Civil War affected the people of St. Louis, Missouri. And shown here is the opening title card of The Crisis. The hero of the story is a young man named Stephen Bryce, a New Englander who moves to St. Louis with his widowed mother in the 1850s. The part of Bryce was played by Tom Sanchez, who had been born in Missouri. He was a well-known leading man by the time The Crisis was filmed. And to give you an idea, between 1907 and 1931, he made over 300 films. He is probably best known for his 1914 film, The Spoilers, where Sanchez and co-star William Farnham wanted to make a bar fight seem as realistic as possible, so they literally fought it out for real. I mean, that's really going the extra mile to make a scene look authentic. And Bryce is given the job of clerking for Judge Silas Whipple, who was a staunch abolitionist. The judge tries to win the boy over to the Republican Party by sending him to listen to new up-and-coming politician Abraham Lincoln as he debates Stephen Douglas. The part of Judge Whipple was played by veteran New York actor George Fawcett. The newspaper article announcing Fawcett would be in the crisis is from the Sunday Telegram from Clarksburg, West Virginia. And one of the more interesting actors to star in The Crisis was Matt B. Snyder, who played Colonel Coleman Carvel, a staunch Southern Democrat and slave owner who was also a friend of Judge Whipple. The friends spar constantly over politics, in particular the issues of secession and slavery. At over 80 years old, Snyder was the oldest member of the cast, and he could also make the claim of being the only Civil War veteran to take part in the movie. He was an actual veteran of the United States Navy, and he had served at Vicksburg during the war. He was a gunner on the ironclad USS Essex, and according to his pension file, he had taken part in the battle with the CSS Arkansas, and he had been wounded at Natchez in August 1862 when an irate citizen shot him in the right shoulder. The old veteran unfortunately died on January 17, 1917, and it was noted in his obituary that he learned to act by working with Edwin Booth, the brother of John Wilkes Booth. So it's just an interesting Civil War connections there for Snyder. And of course, in any good film, you had to have a love interest, and the main female lead and love interest was played by Betsy Eaton, who was portrayed the character of Virginia Carvel. And Virginia Carvel was the love interest of Stephen Bryce, and when the movie centers on their differences over the issue of slavery. When the war begins, Bryce joins the Union Army and eventually fights in the siege of Vicksburg, and the couple is torn apart by the war, only to be reunited at the end through the personal intervention of Abraham Lincoln. Betsy Eaton, who portrays Virginia Carvel, was a prolific actress of the silent film era. She made nearly 200 films between 1911 and 1925. And shown on the left here is a publicity still from the studio, and on the right is a scene from The Crisis with her co-star George Fawcett. Now, for the part of Abraham Lincoln, Selig looked far and wide to find an actor big enough to fill some very big shoes. He was having trouble finding an actor that he thought could authentically portray Lincoln when he received a letter from a gentleman named Sam Drain from Drainsville, Virginia. Drain was an amateur historian who had been studying Lincoln for decades, and he offered to play the part. And in addition to his great knowledge about Abraham Lincoln, he had more than a passing interest, or more than a passing a resemblance to the president. So after meeting with the actor, Selig cast him in the role. Drain's performance was acclaimed by movie critics at the time for being very authentic, but unfortunately the actor himself would not live to see the movie. Drain died shortly after the movie was released, so he never actually got to see himself on the big screen. And this image of Drain on the left shows him in costume as Lincoln for the film. And then another illustration here on the right is taken from the photoplay version of the book that included some scenes from the movie. But I think he does look the part. He has a good resemblance to Lincoln. And the thing that really makes the movie, I think, is that Churchill's dedication to getting the story right and being historically authentic. His descriptions of the siege of Vicksburg were very accurate. He really did his homework, and it clearly shows. Let me just read you a little portion of the novel where he talks about the mining and explosion of the 3rd Louisiana Redan. And this is what he says in the novel. Quote, Not an officer or private in the Vicksburg armies who does not remember the 25th of June and the hour of 3 in the afternoon of the pitiless heat. Silently the long blue files wound into position behind the earth barriers which hid them from the enemy, coiled and ready to strike when the towering redoubt on the Jackson Road should rise heavenwards. By common consent the rifle crack of day and night was hushed, and even the parrots were silent. Stillness closed around the White House of Shirley once more, but not the stillness it had known in the peaceful homestead days. This was the stillness of the death prayer. Eyes staring at the big redoubt were dimmed. At last to those near a little whisk of blue smoke crept out. Then the earth opened with a quake, the sun was darkened, and a hot blast fanned the upturned faces. In the sky through the film of shattered clay, little black dots scurried, poised, and fell again as arms and legs and headless trunks and shapeless bits of wood and iron. Scarcely had the dust settled when the sun caught the light of 50,000 bayonets, and 100 shells were shrieking across the crater's edge. Earth to earth, alas, and dust to dust. Men who ran across the rim of a summer's afternoon died in torture under tier upon tier of their comrades. And so the whole, excuse me, and so the hole was filled. But it's this kind of prose that was brought to life in the film The Crisis. And I think they did a very good job for the time of bringing Churchill's novel to life on screen. And the filming began for The Crisis in early 1916, and most of the interior scenes were shot in Selig's Chicago studios, which you can see pictures of here. And picked to direct The Crisis was Colin Campbell, a Scottish filmmaker who had already made a number of successful films for Selig Polyscope. A movie industry publication noted that to make the film more authentic, quote, 3 cars loaded with special properties, costumes, and armament peculiar to the days of '61 arrived at the Chicago studios last week, and a large force of scenic artists have been working for weeks on interior sets. Thousands of supernumeraries have been engaged to work in spectacular scenes called for in Winston Churchill's novel. And to do stunts for the film, Selig used none other than the legendary screen cowboy Tom Mix, who had already done a number of westerns for Selig Polyscope. And Mix did one stunt in this movie that you really have to see to believe. A contemporary newspaper described it thus: on the slope of a hill is an officer on horseback. A shell explodes deep in the sand beneath the horse and rider, rolling over and over to the bottom of the hill. There is no chance to miss the thrill of this scene. And they're right, because this was not, movie magic. This is 1916. To have the horse roll over on him, they literally rolled the horse over on him down a hill. And you could see it in the movie, and it's impressive as hell. And how he managed to avoid getting killed is, anybody's guess. But that's the sort of scene that you would not be able to make today for numerous reasons, not the least of which is that, people would probably be more concerned about the horse than about Tom Mix. And then the Vicksburg battle scenes, however, were shot on location in Vicksburg, Mississippi. When the citizens of Vicksburg learned that they were going to be hosting a movie crew and that they were going to be filming a movie in the city, they could hardly contain their excitement. The Hill City would be the first major city in the state to be the filming location for a major motion picture. And in March 1916, Selig wrote a letter to Frank Andrews, Secretary of the Vicksburg Board of Trade, in which he said, "I had planned to come down and look over the ground in the near future. In fact, would have been down before, but though perhaps the river was rather high and wished to wait until it had receded some. Kindly let me know if it would be a good time in the near future to come down and look over the ground as to the taking of the crisis." And Mr. Andrews very quickly responded, told Selig to come to Vicksburg within the next 2 weeks. And Selig knew that he was going to need a lot of extras for filming these big battle scenes. And he found them by contracting with the Mississippi National Guard to supply 500 soldiers for 1 week's filming. They were going to portray both the Union and Confederate soldiers. And the cost of hiring the guardsmen came to $8,000, and they were led by Brigadier General Erie C. Scales, who was Adjutant General of the Mississippi National Guard. The guardsmen arrived in Vicksburg, and filming began on May 20th, 1916. There was great regional interest in the proceedings, and the next day's headlines in the New Orleans Item newspaper read, quote, "Work begins on the crisis in Vicksburg." And the author noted in his article that Vicksburg is being moving pictured today. 20 or more actors and directors of the Selig Polyscope Company arrived here Friday from Chicago and immediately started work on scenes for the 10-reel production of the crisis. And General Scales had arrived in Vicksburg on May 21st, 1916, with 500 men and 15 officers. He had them march out to Camp Williamson outside of the city, which would be their home during the filming. Unfortunately, they arrived in the middle of a pouring rain. And the Vicksburg Daily Herald noted, quote, that General Scales said that without exaggeration, some of the men were over knee-deep in the terrible flood which swept through Camp Williamson bottom, and practically all of the tents which had been pitched had to be taken down in the pouring rain and placed over the hillside. But the article went on to state, not the least bit discouraged over their soaking Sunday night, the plucky Mississippi boys are ready for their picture duty. And unfortunately, I was unable to find any contemporary pictures of Camp Williamson, so I'm showing on the left here the modern historical marker just south of Vicksburg near the site of Camp Williamson. And these are the photo postcard here is of troops training at Camp Shelby from around the same time period. And then the first big battle scene was filmed on May 23rd at South Fort in the Vicksburg National Military Park. And the Daily Herald newspaper stated, quote, "Startling realism marks the battle scenes." And the article noted, "Beneath a blue sky, singularly clear and ideal for the wonderful setting, the Selig warriors rushed upon each other in deadly conflict near South Fort, and for hours the raging warfare for the motion picture screen was unrelentingly kept up in all its fury. 600 men of the National Guard, equally divided in blue and gray uniforms, some badly soiled and ragged, portrayed in most graphic realism the scenes of long ago, as the fierce charges and defense of the old hilltops were fought out to the bitter end." And this picture is actually a still from the filming at South Fort. I was fortunate enough to pick up a photograph album of images from the filming of the movie. And I'm going to be showing a number of scenes, individual stills from the movie here as we go along. And among the onlookers watching the filming were a number of Confederate veterans. And in fact, the Vicksburg Herald noted, quote, "Yesterday afternoon, Tom Sanchez made a wonderful charge up South Fort Hill, carrying the flag to the breastworks amid tongues of livid flame, followed by several hundred wounded or infuriated soldiers charging the gray lines. Such grand old veterans as Colonel W.A. Montgomery, who was an onlooker wearing his gray uniform, watched the mimic warfare with eager interest and made comments upon today and the days that used to be, where such struggles were death to thousands." I love that quote. It must have been really something for those old veterans to be watching this filming, right on the site of where the actual fighting had taken place. On May 25th, the filming of battle scenes shifted to Fort Garrett, and both the Union and Confederate extras marched through town on their way to the filming site. A local journalist described the march through town, and in doing so, he made it very clear where his loyalties lay. And he said, "From window and doorway and down the sunny street, spectators stood and gazed, not without a curious tugging of heartstrings at the sight of the ragged gray, not without a fluttering and leaping of the pulse at the sound of marching feet. Men from a bygone age whose glory still envelops the Southland. Men marching to defend our own beautiful city. Men whose moldering forms sleep beneath the hills on which the play battles are staged. It was these we watched tramping by, and not the irresponsible militia of 1916, called upon to reproduce in replica the hallowed scenes of the past. And I love that quote, just very descriptive. And in addition to the filming done in the park on May 25th, other scenes were shot at the courthouse and down on the levee. These scenes allowed Vicksburg citizens to become part of the film, as many civilian extras were needed. And this photo, in fact, shows one of the stars of the crisis, Betsy Eaton, who was seated to the left here, along with some of the extras from the movie. On May 31st, the production suffered its first casualty when Ford Dixon, a member of the Warren Light Artillery, was wounded during the filming at Fort Garrett. According to the newspaper account, the unlucky Dixon, quote, happened to be on a spot when a mine with several pounds of powder was touched off. His eyelashes were burned and his eyes are inflamed. His left ear was also burned. Fortunately, this was the extent of his injuries, and he did make a full recovery. And then some of the last scenes to be shot in Vicksburg before filming wrapped on May 31st, and that was one of the biggest scenes of the movie, the filming of the bombardment of Vicksburg by Union Ironclads. And this scene was filmed on the night of June 2nd, 1916, and was watched by a crowd that one journalist estimated to be in the thousands. And the Vicksburg Daily Herald said of the scene, "The 7 gunboats were lined up in the middle of the lake north of the city, and the cameramen, 3 in all, took the vivid picture from a barge, which was stationed on the side of the canal near the National Cemetery Road. The fire from the gunboats came hastily, shots being sent up from one and then another of the battery of 7 in line, and occasionally volleys would roar out of the sides of all 7 boats at the same time." This is... For a silent film, I mean, this is really incredible that they actually mocked up ironclads. They had taken barges and turned them into ironclads for the filming. And I think they look pretty good, all things considered. For 1916, I think they did a heck of a job. And then one Vicksburg citizen ended up with quite a souvenir to remember the filming of the crisis. He ended up with a wife. Vicksburg lawyer Clark B Coffey met the female lead of the film, Betsy Eaton, at a costume ball held by the city to honor the members of the Selig cast. And the two immediately fell in love, and in September they traveled to California, where they were immediately married. The New Orleans State's newspaper wrote, "Betsy Eaton, the Selig movie star, looked so enticing in hoop skirts, such as were made over a half-century ago, that attorney Clark Coffey of Vicksburg, Mississippi, was struck squarely and fairly by Cupid's darts." And I wish I could say they lived happily ever after, but unfortunately that was not the case. The pair ended up divorcing in 1923. But Coffey had followed his wife to Los Angeles, and in the 1920 census, he listed his occupation as actor. So apparently he got the acting bug once he was out in California. He made a number of movies, including one known as The Secret Service Sanders, and this is the movie poster from that film. And by today's standards, movies were edited very quickly, and the finished film had its first showing at the Strand Theater in New York on September 29th, 1916. It was for a private audience. A second private showing was held in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the Majestic Theater, and then it was followed in December 1916 by public performances. Reviews of the film were very good. One article stated that, quote, "The acting is superb, the battle scenes are spectacular and finely executed. The story of Winston Churchill's novel has been scenarioized so capably that the excellence of the original has been retained." And shown in the pictures here are the Strand Theater in New York, which was one of the locations where the film was shown. And unfortunately, this old theater was torn down in 1987, but boy, it looked grand in its day. And the first record I can find of the crisis being shown in Mississippi is from an ad in the Biloxi Daily Herald dated March 1st, 1917, which stated the crisis will be shown at Ducat's Theater, Biloxi, and the Gulfport Opera House soon. So tremendous has been the clamor of the Mississippi public to see the big Civil War drama that the management has found it expedient to send the picture to a few of the better towns even before the forthcoming engagement at the fashionable Tulane Theater in New Orleans. And the crisis had gained very good reviews from newspapers across the nation, and it did well at the box office, but it was not the blockbuster that Birth of a Nation was, which is really given a shame considering that the crisis really dealt with the causes of the war in a much more honest fashion than Birth of a Nation did. Unlike Birth of a Nation, that reinforced prevailing white notions of the inferiority of African Americans and fitted very comfortably into the lost cause interpretation of Southern history, the crisis really made slavery the centerpiece of the story. For example, here is how Winston Churchill described in his novel character Stephen Bryce's exposure to a slave auction for the first time. Quote, "There in the bright November sunlight, a sight met his eyes which turned him sick and dizzy. Against the walls and pillars of the building, already grimy with soot, crouched a score of miserable human beings waiting to be sold at auction." And in addition to the uncomfortable racial angle to the movie, the film, I think, was also hurt by Americans' increasing preoccupation with World War I. The American public was very concerned with current events because of the lead-up of the United States entering the conflict on April 6, 1917. And in fact, Selig actually tried to use World War I as a selling point. In one of his ads for the movie, included pictures of both Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson, and included was the tagline, "What would Lincoln have done had he been president now? What would Wilson have done had he been president then?" But regardless of how clever their advertising was, the war had to be a big distraction to the movie-going audience. But still, it was a very well-made film. It covered the war in a very honest way that you didn't often see in movies of this time period. And I would urge you to see the movie yourself. The Crisis is available on YouTube. There's actually two versions of it that I've seen online on YouTube. The one you ought to watch if you're interested in seeing it is there's a version that was downloaded by someone from a Spanish-speaking country. Doesn't matter since it's a silent film and all the title cards are in English. That's version. It seems to be more complete than the other version I've seen that's on YouTube. But I would highly recommend you take a look at it. This is an early film, and it really deserves to be better known than it is. If for no other reason, there's so many interesting scenes of Vicksburg. I mean, this movie was shot in 1916, and there were still a lot of Civil War era buildings standing at that time that are gone now. So, if for no other reason, it's neat to see Vicksburg as it was at the in the early days of the 20th century before progress claimed so many more Civil War buildings. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you liked it, please give me a like, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. It's really my best way of gauging how much content I should try and provide. And I hope you liked it, and thank you very much.